In the grand halls of Willow Grange, a priceless family Bible vanishes during a tense reunion. Its hidden relic, a saint's bone worth a fortune, stolen from under locked glass. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose quiet knitting hides a mind unraveling secrets. As suspicions swirl around a debt-ridden heir, a resentful cousin, a nervous pastor, and a charming stranger, Miss Marple sets a cunning trap, exposing greed, betrayal, and a plot that threatens to tear the Havisham family apart. Will she uncover the thief before the relic is lost forever? Dive into a classic mystery of deception and discovery. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Willow Grange. The August sun hung low over the Sussex hills, casting a golden haze across the sprawling lawns of Willow Grange, a manor house that seemed to doze in its own antiquity. Its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows spoke of centuries past, of Havishams who had lived, loved, and quarreled within its confines. Today, the house stirred with the bustle of a family reunion, a rare occasion that drew kin from far and wide to celebrate their shared lineage. In a quiet corner of the terrace, Miss Jane Marple, a slight figure with silver hair and a deceptively mild countenance, sat in a wicker chair, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of a metronome. Her invitation had come from her distant cousin, Lady Beatrice Havisham, a gracious but distracted hostess who insisted Jane's presence would lend a certain charm to the gathering. Miss Marple, ever observant, suspected Beatrice's motives were less about charm and more about needing a steadying influence amid the family's fractious dynamics. The terrace overlooked a garden where roses clung stubbornly to their last blooms, and the air carried the faint hum of bees and the chatter of assembled guests. The Havishams were a proud lot, their name etched in local lore, and at the heart of their pride lay the family Bible, a leather-bound relic from the 16th century, its pages yellowed but intact, housed in a glass case in the drawing room. It was said to contain a secret, though what that secret was, few could say with certainty. Miss Marple, whose knowledge of village gossip was as extensive as her understanding of human nature, had heard whispers of a hidden compartment, perhaps concealing a relic of some value. She filed this away, her eyes scanning the figures moving about the lawn. Edward Havisham, the heir, dominated the scene with his booming voice and broad gestures. A man in his mid-40s, with a florid complexion and a mustache that seemed to bristle with self-importance, he held court near the croquet lawn, regaling a cluster of cousins with tales of the family's storied past. "We Havishams built this county," he declared, his hand sweeping toward the house. "And that Bible, why, it's the very soul of our heritage." Miss Marple noted the theatricality of his words, as if he were rehearsing for an audience. She also noticed the tightness around his eyes, a hint of strain that suggested all was not well in Edward's world. A passing comment from a maid, overheard earlier, hinted at his recent troubles with creditors, a detail that piqued her interest. Nearby, Clara Morton, a distant cousin, stood apart, her sharp features set in a frown as she sipped lemonade. Her dress, though elegant, was slightly outmoded, and her posture spoke of a woman who carried grudges as carefully as she carried her handbag. Clara's eyes darted toward Edward with barely concealed disdain, and when their gazes met, a flicker of hostility passed between them. Miss Marple, pretending to adjust her knitting, recalled Beatrice mentioning Clara's passion for genealogy. "She's spent years tracing our line," Beatrice had said, but she's never forgiven Edward for inheriting the estate. Clara's knowledge of the family's artifacts, including the Bible, was likely extensive, a point worth remembering. Reverend Timothy Wells, the local pastor, hovered near the tea table, his thin frame almost lost in his black clerical suit. His fingers fidgeted with a small prayer book, and his eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, darted nervously about. He murmured greetings to passing guests, quoting snippets of scripture with a fervor that seemed more anxious than devout. Miss Marple, who had a knack for spotting inconsistencies, noted how often he glanced toward the drawing room, where the Bible rested. Was it reverence, she wondered, or something else? His sermon the previous Sunday, she recalled, had dwelt heavily on the sanctity of relics, a curious choice for a village congregation. The most intriguing figure, however, was Mr. Lawrence Gray, a guest whose presence puzzled Miss Marple. He was a man of indeterminate age, with a lean, handsome face and a manner so polished it bordered on artifice. Introduced as an old friend of Beatrice's late husband, he moved through the crowd with effortless charm, yet his conversations were curiously vague. He lingered near the French doors leading to the drawing room, his gaze occasionally resting on the Bible's case. When he caught Miss Marple watching, he offered a disarming smile, but she sensed a watchfulness beneath his ease. A collector, perhaps, she mused, her needles pausing briefly. Or something else entirely. As the afternoon waned, Beatrice announced the traditional reading from the family Bible, a ritual that marked every Havisham reunion. The guests drifted toward the drawing room, their chatter softening in anticipation. Miss Marple, lingering at the rear, felt a prickle of unease. The air held the faint charge of impending drama, like the stillness before a storm. She adjusted her shawl and followed, her mind already sifting through the day's observations, the tensions, the glances, the secrets half-spoken. Something was afoot at Willow Grange, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unerring instinct, intended to uncover it. Chapter 2. The Bible Vanishes. The drawing room of Willow Grange, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, was a study in faded grandeur. Its oak-paneled walls, adorned with portraits of stern-faced Havishams, seemed to watch the assembled guests with silent disapproval. The air was thick with the scent of old books and polished wood, and at the room's heart stood the glass case containing the family Bible, a relic of such reverence that it commanded attention even in silence. The Bible, bound in cracked leather with gilt lettering worn to a whisper, rested on a velvet cushion, its presence a tangible link to centuries of Havisham legacy. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the fireplace in a high-backed chair, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, observed the gathering with her usual unobtrusive acuity. Her mild eyes, framed by silver spectacles, missed nothing. The way hands fidgeted, the glances exchanged, the subtle shifts in posture that betrayed unease. Lady Beatrice Havisham, her face flushed with the effort of hosting, stood before the case, her hands clasped as she addressed the room. "As is our tradition," she began, her voice carrying a practiced warmth, "we shall read from the family Bible, a custom begun by my great-grandfather to honor our unity." The guests, a mix of family and a few invited friends, nodded politely, though Miss Marple noted varying degrees of enthusiasm. Edward Havisham, the heir, stood closest to his aunt, his chest puffed out as if he himself were the Bible's custodian. Clara Morton, the sharp-faced cousin, leaned against a bookcase, Her lips pursed in a way that suggested she found the ritual tiresome. Reverend Timothy Wells, clutching his prayer book like a talisman, hovered near the case, his eyes darting between Beatrice and the Bible. Mr. Lawrence Gray, the enigmatic guest, stood at the room's edge, his expression one of polite curiosity, though Miss Marple caught the faint tightening of his jaw as Beatrice spoke. Beatrice reached for the small brass key that hung on a chain at her waist, a key known to all as the sole means of opening the case. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards, as guests shifted for a better view. With a practiced gesture, Beatrice inserted the key, turned it, and lifted the glass lid. Her smile froze. A collective gasp rose from the room as all eyes fixed on the empty velvet cushion. The Bible was gone. For a moment, silence reigned, heavy and disbelieving. Then chaos erupted. Edward's voice boomed first, his face reddening. "This is outrageous. Who's responsible for this?" He rounded on the nearest servant, a young maid who shrank back, her eyes wide with alarm. Clara's laugh, sharp and mirthless, cut through the din. "Typical," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "No one ever watches the precious heirlooms properly." Reverend Wells, his face ashen, murmured a prayer, his fingers tightening around his book until his knuckles whitened. Mr. Gray stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Let's not jump to conclusions. A search should be made at once." His suggestion, reasonable as it was, seemed to Miss Marple almost too composed, as if he had anticipated the moment. Beatrice, her hands trembling, closed the case with a thud. "This cannot be," she whispered, her eyes scanning the room as if the Bible might materialize. "It was here this morning. I checked it myself." Her distress was genuine, and Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the flicker of fear in her cousin's eyes. The Bible was more than a book. It was a symbol of the Havisham name, and its loss was a wound to the family's pride. But Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the whispered tales of a hidden compartment within the Bible, a secret known to few. Was the theft about the book itself, or something concealed within its ancient pages? The commotion drew the attention of the household staff, who gathered at the doorway, their whispers adding to the cacophony. Edward, seizing control, barked orders. "Search every room, check the windows, the doors. Someone's taken it." His indignation, Miss Marple observed, had a performative quality, as if he were more concerned with appearing outraged than with the loss itself. Clara, meanwhile, slipped out of the room, her movements brisk and purposeful. Miss Marple made a mental note of her departure, wondering if it was mere restlessness or something more deliberate. Reverend Wells approached Beatrice, his voice low but urgent. "This is a sacrilege, Lady Beatrice. The Bible is a sacred trust. We must pray for its return." His words were pious, but Miss Marple caught the tremor in his voice, the way his eyes avoided the empty case. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the shock of the moment? Mr. Gray, ever the diplomat, suggested calling the police, a proposal Beatrice accepted with a weary nod. "Yes," she said, "we must inform Inspector Craddock at once." Within the hour, Inspector Craddock arrived, his brisk efficiency a stark contrast to the family's disarray. A man of middle age, with a no-nonsense demeanor, he surveyed the room with a practiced eye, his notebook already open. "Right then," he said, addressing the gathered guests. "When was the Bible last seen, and who had access to this room?" His tone was clipped, his questions direct, but Miss Marple sensed a certain rigidity in his approach, as if he expected the solution to present itself in neat, orderly fashion. She had worked with Craddock before and knew his competence, but she also knew his tendency to overlook the subtler currents of human behavior. Beatrice recounted the morning's events. "I saw the Bible at 9 o'clock when I dusted the case myself. The room was locked afterward, as always, and the key remained with me." She held up the brass key, its weight a small reassurance in her hand. Craddock examined the case, noting the absence of scratches or signs of forced entry. "So," he said, "either the thief had a key, or the case was opened when it wasn't locked." His eyes swept the room, lingering on Edward, who bristled under the scrutiny. "Nonsense," Edward snapped. "The staff must have been careless. One of them likely left the door ajar." His accusation drew indignant murmurs from the servants, but Craddock silenced them with a raised hand. "We'll question everyone," he said. "No one leaves the house until we've searched every inch." The search began at once, with constables combing the drawing room, the library, and the upstairs bedrooms. Guests and staff alike were questioned, their alibis noted with meticulous care. Edward claimed to have been on the croquet lawn all morning, a fact corroborated by several cousins, though Miss Marple noted their reluctance, as if they feared contradicting him. Clara, when found in the garden, said she'd been pruning roses, but no one could confirm her whereabouts before noon. Reverend Wells admitted to visiting the drawing room briefly to admire the Bible, but insisted he'd left it untouched. Mr. Gray, with his characteristic calm, said he'd been in the library reading, a claim supported by a footman who'd seen him there. Yet Miss Marple, ever attuned to discrepancies, wondered why Gray's hands, when she'd glimpsed them earlier, bore faint smudges of dust, as if he'd been handling something older than the library's modern novels. As the search continued, Miss Marple slipped away to examine the drawing room herself. The glass case, now the center of attention, stood on a mahogany table, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. She knelt, her movements slow but deliberate, and studied the table's edge. A faint disturbance in the dust caught her eye. A smudge, barely perceptible, suggesting something had been moved. It was not the Bible's outline, which would have been larger, but something smaller, more compact. Her mind turned to the rumored compartment within the Bible. Could the thief have known of it? And if so, had they taken the book to conceal their true target? She rose, brushing her hands, and caught sight of Clara re-entering the room. The cousin's face was composed, but her eyes were bright with a nervous energy. "No luck, I presume?" Clara said, her tone light but edged with something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "None yet," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "But I find these things often reveal themselves in time." Clara's smile was thin, and she excused herself quickly, leaving Miss Marple to ponder her haste. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, focused on the practical. He examined the windows, locked with no signs of tampering, and the French doors leading to the terrace, which showed no evidence of forced entry. "This was an inside job," he concluded, his voice low. "Someone in this house took it, and they knew exactly what they were doing." His words sent a ripple of unease through the guests, who exchanged wary glances. Edward, seizing the moment, declared, "We must double the search, check the attics, the cellars, everywhere." His fervor, Miss Marple thought, was almost too emphatic, as if he wished to divert attention from himself. Reverend Wells, standing near the fireplace, seemed to shrink into himself. "This is a test," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "A trial of our faith." Miss Marple, approaching him under the pretense of adjusting her shawl, asked softly, "Do you think the Bible's loss is a spiritual matter, Reverend?" He started, his eyes meeting hers briefly before sliding away. "It is a sacred object," he said. "Its absence is troubling." His hesitation, slight but telling, lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Mr. Gray, who had been assisting the constables with an air of detached helpfulness, approached Craddock with a suggestion. "Have you considered the possibility of a distraction? Perhaps someone created a diversion to slip the Bible out unnoticed." His theory was sound, but Miss Marple noted the way he watched Craddock's reaction as if gauging how much the inspector suspected. She recalled his earlier proximity to the case, his hands brushing the table as he passed. Was it coincidence, or had he been closer to the crime than he let on? As evening fell, the search yielded nothing. The Bible, it seemed, had vanished as completely as a shadow in a storm. Beatrice, exhausted and near tears, retired to her room, leaving Craddock to coordinate the next steps. The guests dispersed, their conversations hushed but charged with speculation. Miss Marple, returning to her chair by the fireplace, resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet. The theft, she knew, was no simple act of opportunism. The Bible's value lay not only in its age, but in its secret. A relic, perhaps, or something else entirely. The key, she sensed, lay in the motives of those present. Edward's financial woes, Clara's resentment, Wells' unease, Gray's inscrutability. Each held a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and unerring instinct, was determined to fit them together. She glanced at the empty case, its glass reflecting the flickering light of the chandelier. "Someone in this room knows more than they're saying," she thought, "and they're watching, waiting for a mistake." Her needles paused, then resumed their rhythm. The game, as she saw it, had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Heir's Ambition. The morning after the Bible's disappearance dawned gray and heavy, the Sussex sky cloaked in clouds that mirrored the mood at Willow Grange. The house, usually alive with the hum of family chatter, was subdued, its occupants moving with the cautious tread of those aware they were under scrutiny. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small table in the morning room, sipped her tea and observed the comings and goings with her customary quiet attentiveness. Her knitting lay beside her, a convenient prop that allowed her to blend into the background while her mind worked tirelessly. The theft of the Havisham family Bible was no mere act of mischief, she was certain. It was a calculated move, driven by motives as old as human nature itself, greed, envy, or perhaps something deeper. Her thoughts turned to Edward Havisham, the heir, whose bluster the previous evening had struck her as more theatrical than heartfelt. He was a man who wore his pride like a badge, yet Miss Marple had seen the cracks beneath his polished exterior, the strained smile, the restless hands, the way his eyes darted to the estate's ledgers when he thought no one was watching. She decided to begin her inquiries with him, for if anyone stood to gain, or lose, from the Bible's fate, it was surely the man who saw himself as the family's standard-bearer. Edward was in the library, a cavernous room lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes. He stood by a window, staring out at the rain-slicked lawns, his broad shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible burden. Miss Marple entered quietly, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. "Good morning, Edward," she said, her voice gentle, but carrying that faint note of authority that often surprised those who underestimated her. "I hope I'm not intruding." He turned, his face briefly registering irritation before smoothing into a forced smile. "Not at all, Miss Marple, though I'm afraid I'm poor company today. This business with the Bible, it's a disgrace." He gestured expansively, as if to dismiss the matter, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It is distressing," she agreed. "The Bible is such a symbol of your family's heritage. I imagine its loss must feel like a personal blow to you, as the heir." Her words were carefully chosen, an invitation for him to reveal more than he might intend. Edward seized the bait, his voice rising with indignation. "A blow? It's a catastrophe. That Bible has been in our family for 400 years. It's the cornerstone of our legacy, proof of our place in history." He paced the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "I had plans, you know, grand plans, to restore Willow Grange to its former glory. The Bible was to be the centerpiece of a family museum, a draw for visitors, a way to secure the estate's future." He paused, his gaze distant, as if envisioning the crowds that would never come. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of sympathetic interest. "A museum? What a splendid idea, though I suppose such an undertaking requires considerable funds." She let the observation hang in the air, her tone as innocent as a village gossip sharing news over tea. Edward's face tightened, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, funds can always be found," he said airily. "The Havershams have resources, connections. It's a matter of priorities." Yet his fingers drummed against the arm of a chair, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. She recalled a snippet of conversation overheard at the village post office, where the grocer had mentioned Edward's unpaid accounts, a topic that had caused much whispering among the locals. Could his ambition for Willow Grange be outstripped by his debts? She shifted the conversation subtly. "The Bible's value, of course, goes beyond sentiment. I've heard talk of a hidden compartment, some sort of relic, perhaps?" Her question was casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching for his reaction. Edward's pacing stopped abruptly. "A relic? Oh, that's just family folklore," he said, waving a hand. "Some nonsense about a saint's bone or some such. No one's ever seen it. The Bible's value is in its history, not some fairy tale." His dismissal was too quick, too emphatic, and Miss Marple's mind registered the discrepancy. If the relic was mere folklore, why did his voice carry that edge of defensiveness? Before she could press further, the library door opened, and Inspector Craddock entered, his notebook in hand. "Mr. Haversham," he said briskly, "I'd like a word about your movements yesterday morning." His tone was professional, but Miss Marple sensed his frustration. The search of the house had turned up nothing, and the inspector was grasping for leads. Edward's irritation flared anew. "I've told you, Inspector, I was on the croquet lawn with my cousins. Ask them. They'll confirm it." His voice carried a hint of arrogance, as if he expected the matter to be settled by his word alone. Craddock nodded, jotting a note, but his eyes lingered on Edward, assessing. Miss Marple excused herself, leaving the men to their discussion. As she stepped into the hall, she nearly collided with Clara Morton, who was passing with a stack of papers under her arm. Clara's eyes narrowed, and she offered a curt nod before hurrying on. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the purposeful stride, the way Clara clutched the papers as if they were precious. Was she merely organizing her genealogical research, or was there more to her activities? Miss Marple resolved to speak with her next, for Clara's bitterness toward Edward suggested motives that could not be ignored. Back in the morning room, Miss Marple retrieved her knitting and settled by the window, her thoughts turning over the morning's discoveries. Edward's ambition was clear, but so was his desperation. The museum was a noble dream, but dreams required money, and money, it seemed, was in short supply. The Bible, with its rumored relic, could fetch a fortune on the black market, a temptation for a man in debt. Yet Edward's dismissal of the relic intrigued her. Was he truly ignorant of its existence, or was he hiding his knowledge to protect himself? She thought, too, of the other suspects. Clara's resentment was a thread worth pulling. Her expertise in the family's history might extend to the Bible's secrets. Reverend Wells, with his nervous piety, had been too quick to hover near the case, his words laced with an anxiety that went beyond spiritual concern. And Mr. Gray, with his polished charm and vague explanations, remained an enigma. Each had opportunity, each had motive, but the truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the small details, the glance, the gesture, the word, unspoken. As she knitted, a memory surfaced from her village of St. Mary Mead. Old Mr. Grayson, a local squire, had once lost a valuable pocket watch, only to find it had been taken by his nephew, who sold it to pay gambling debts. The nephew, like Edward, had protested his innocence loudly, but his extravagance had betrayed him. "People are so very predictable," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her needles clicking softly, "and yet so very careful to hide it." She glanced out the window, where the rain had begun to fall in earnest, blurring the outlines of the garden. The Bible's disappearance was a puzzle, but puzzles, in Miss Marple's experience, always had a solution. She would watch and listen and wait. The truth, she was certain, would reveal itself in time, as it always did to those who knew where to look. Chapter 4. The Cousin's Resentment. The rain that had begun as a drizzle now drummed steadily against the windows of Willow Grange, casting a somber pall over the house. Inside, the atmosphere was no less heavy, with the theft of the family Bible hanging like a fog over the Havisham reunion. Miss Jane Marple, ever the unobtrusive observer, sat in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and the faint scent of damp earth. Her knitting needles moved with their usual quiet rhythm, but her eyes were alert, scanning the garden beyond where Clara Morton, the sharp-tongued cousin, was at work among the rose bushes. Clara's movements were vigorous, almost aggressive, as she clipped dead blooms with a pair of shears, her face set in a scowl that suggested her thoughts were far from the task at hand. Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity, decided it was time to explore Clara's role in the unfolding drama. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and stepped into the garden, her umbrella raised against the rain. "Clara, my dear," she called, her voice carrying that gentle, disarming quality that invited confidences. "You're quite dedicated to these roses, even in this weather." Clara started, her shears pausing mid-snip, and turned to face Miss Marple. Her eyes, sharp as the blades in her hand, softened only slightly at the sight of the older woman. "Oh, Miss Marple," Clara said, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "The roses need tending, rain or no. Besides, it keeps me out of that house, with all its nonsense." Her tone was brisk, But Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of bitterness, a note that resonated with what she'd observed at the reunion. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly interest. "Nonsense? You mean the fuss over the Bible?" She stepped closer, her umbrella shielding them both from the worst of the rain. It must be frustrating, seeing such a treasure mishandled. Clara's lips tightened, and she drove her shears into the soil with unnecessary force. Mishandled? That's putting it mildly. Edward treats it like his personal trophy, as if the rest of us don't exist. That Bible belongs to the whole family, not just him. Her words spilled out, laced with a resentment that had clearly been simmering for years. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her silence encouraging Clara to continue. "It's not just the Bible," Clara went on, her voice lowering as if wary of being overheard. "It's everything. Edward inherited Willow Grange, the title, the lot, while the rest of us scrape by. I've spent years researching our family, tracing every branch, every story. I know more about the Havershams than he ever will. But does that matter? Number he lords it over us, waving that Bible like a scepter." Her hands trembled slightly, and Miss Marple noted the intensity in her eyes, a fire that spoke of more than mere envy. "Your research sounds fascinating," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but probing. "You must know all about the Bible's history then. I've heard it's quite special. Something about a hidden compartment, perhaps?" She let the question hang, her eyes soft but watchful. Clara's gaze flickered, and for a moment her hands stilled. "Oh, that old tale," she said, her laugh brittle. "Yes, I've read about it in the family archives. Supposedly there's a compartment in the binding, made to hide a relic, a saint's finger bone, if you believe the stories. Probably just a legend to make us seem grander than we are." Her dismissal was casual, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the shears. Clara knew more. Tien more than she was letting on, and Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibilities. Was the relic the true prize, and had Clara's knowledge of it driven her to act? "You've studied it closely, then?" Miss Marple asked, her voice as mild as the rain. "It must be a remarkable book to hold such a secret." Clara shrugged, turning back to the roses. "It's a dusty old thing, but yes, I've looked at it. I catalogued the family artifacts for Beatrice last year, the Bible's 16th century, with annotations from generations of Havershams. The compartment's real enough. I saw the seam in the binding. But as for a relic, I wouldn't know. It's probably empty." Her words were clipped, and she resumed her pruning with renewed vigor, as if eager to end the conversation. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind cataloguing Clara's words. The cousin's familiarity with the Bible was significant. Few others would know its secrets so well. Yet her bitterness toward Edward suggested a personal motive, one that might outweigh the lure of a relic's value. "It must be difficult," Miss Marple said, "to see such a treasure in Edward's hands when you've worked so hard to preserve the family's history." Clara's eyes flashed. "Difficult? It's infuriating. He doesn't care about the history, only the glory. He'd sell the lot if it meant keeping this crumbling pile afloat." She gestured toward the house, her voice thick with disdain. "And now the Bible's gone, and he's blaming everyone but himself. Typical." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, but her mind was racing. Clara's anger was palpable, and her knowledge of the Bible's hidden compartment was a thread worth following. Had her resentment pushed her to theft, perhaps to strike at Edward, or to claim the relic for herself. The rain began to ease, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to steer the conversation further. "I suppose the Bible's loss could benefit someone," she mused. "A relic like that might fetch a pretty penny, mightn't it?" Clara's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "What are you implying, Miss Marple? I'm no thief." Her voice was sharp, but there was a defensive edge to it, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush in her cheeks. "I'm just saying Edward's carelessness is no surprise. He's probably sold it himself to pay his debts." The accusation hung in the air, and Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Debts? Oh dear, that sounds serious." She let her voice trail off, inviting Clara to elaborate. Clara hesitated, then plunged on. "Everyone knows he's in trouble. The estate's bleeding money, and he's been borrowing from half the county. I wouldn't be surprised if he staged this theft to cover his tracks." Her words were venomous, and Miss Marple wondered if Clara's accusations were genuine or a deflection. The cousin's knowledge of Edward's finances was another piece of the puzzle, but it also suggested a motive to discredit him. Before Miss Marple could respond, a footman appeared at the conservatory door, calling for Clara. "Lady Beatrice wishes to see you, Miss Morton," he said, and Clara, with a muttered curse, gathered her shears and papers and strode off. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the conversation. Clara's resentment was a powerful force, and her expertise in the family's artifacts made her a formidable suspect. Yet her accusations against Edward were too pointed, too convenient. Was she genuinely outraged, or was she weaving a narrative to protect herself? Returning to the conservatory, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting needles clicking softly. The rain had stopped, leaving the garden glistening under a tentative sun. She thought of Clara's words, her knowledge of the Bible's compartment, her bitterness toward Edward. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a woman much like Clara, a spinster with a passion for local history, who had once stolen a church relic to prove a point about its mismanagement. The parallel was striking, and Miss Marple wondered if Clara's resentment had driven her to a similar act of defiance, or something more mercenary. Inspector Craddock's voice interrupted her thoughts as he entered the conservatory, his face etched with frustration. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding in greeting. "No sign of the Bible yet. I've questioned the staff again, but they're either clueless or covering for someone." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This case is a tangle." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Tangles have a way of unraveling, Inspector. It's often a matter of pulling the right thread." She paused, her eyes thoughtful. "Have you spoken to Clara Morton at length? She seems to have strong feelings about the family's affairs." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "Clara? She's a prickly one, but she claims she was in the garden all morning. No one can confirm it, though." He frowned, considering. "You think she's worth a closer look?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice mild, "that people with strong feelings often act in unexpected ways. But then, so do people with secrets." She resumed her knitting, leaving Craddock to ponder her words. As he left to continue his inquiries, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Clara. The cousin's knowledge, her resentment, her unguarded moments in the garden, all pointed to a woman with both opportunity and motive. Yet the puzzle was far from complete. Edward's debts, Wells's nervous piety, Gray's enigmatic presence, each was a piece, and Miss Marple knew the truth lay in their connections. She would continue to watch, to listen, to piece together the fragments of human nature that always, in the end, revealed the truth. Chapter 5. The Pastor's Burden. The rain had cleared by midday, leaving the grounds of Willow Grange glistening under a pale sun, but the atmosphere within the manor remained heavy with suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human behavior, decided to turn her attention to Reverend Timothy Wells, the local pastor whose nervous demeanor had caught her eye from the start. His anxious hovering near the Bible's display case during the reunion, coupled with his fervent references to its sanctity, suggested a man wrestling with more than spiritual concerns. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through the masks people wore, sensed that the Reverend's burden might hold a key to the mystery of the stolen Bible. She found him in the village church, a modest stone building a short walk from the estate. The church, with its ancient yew trees and weathered gravestones, exuded a quiet solemnity, and Miss Marple paused at the gate to absorb its peace before entering. Inside, the air was cool and faintly musty, redolent of old hymnals and beeswax. Reverend Wells was at the altar, polishing a brass candlestick with a vigor that seemed more about distraction than devotion. His thin frame was hunched, his spectacles slipping down his nose, and his hands moved in quick, jerky motions. When Miss Marple's footsteps echoed on the stone floor, he started, nearly dropping the candlestick. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, his voice high and strained. "I didn't hear you come in." He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting an interruption. "I was just tending to the altar. It's important to keep things in order, especially in times of trial." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle understanding. "Of course, Reverend. A church is a sanctuary, and you keep it beautifully." She settled onto a pew, her hands folded in her lap, her demeanor inviting confidences. "I imagine the loss of the Haversham Bible must weigh heavily on you. You spoke so eloquently of its sacredness at the reunion." Wells's face paled, and he set the candlestick down with care, as if it might shatter. "Yes, it's a terrible loss," he murmured, his fingers twisting the polishing cloth. "That Bible is more than a book. It's a testament to faith, a relic of the family's devotion. Its theft is a desecration." His voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, fixing instead on the crucifix above the altar. She leaned forward slightly, her tone soft but probing. "You were near the case during the reunion, weren't you? I couldn't help but notice your interest in it. Such a treasure must hold special meaning for a man of the cloth." Her words were carefully chosen, a gentle nudge to draw out what lay beneath his agitation. Wells's hands stilled, and for a moment, silence hung between them. I did admire it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a rare thing, a Bible that old, with annotations from generations of Havershams. I only wanted to study it, to draw inspiration for my sermons." He hesitated, then added, "I meant no harm." The last words came too quickly, and Miss Marple's keen senses registered the defensive note in his tone. "I'm sure you didn't," she said, her smile reassuring. "But it's curious, isn't it? How such a well-guarded object could vanish. Beatrice mentioned the case was locked, with the key always on her person. It suggests someone knew exactly how to get to it." She paused, letting the implication settle. "Have you any thoughts on who might have been so bold?" Wells's fingers tightened around the cloth, and he began polishing again, though the candlestick gleamed already. "I wouldn't know. he said, his voice strained. "It's not my place to speculate. The Lord will reveal the truth in His time." He quoted a verse under his breath, something about judgment and righteousness. But Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes flickered toward the vestry door. She shifted the conversation, her tone as light as if discussing the weather. "I heard your sermon last Sunday was quite stirring. Something about the sanctity of relics, I believe. It must be a comfort to speak of such things, given the Bible's rumored secret. A relic of its own, perhaps?" Her question was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any crack in his composure. Wells froze, the cloth slipping from his fingers. "A relic?" he said, his voice hoarse. "Oh, yes, there's talk of a compartment in the Bible, but I've never seen it. Just stories, you know. Old family tales." He bent to retrieve the cloth, his movements clumsy, and Miss Marple saw a bead of sweat on his temple. His denial, like Clara's, was too quick, too practiced, and she wondered what he was hiding. Had he seen the compartment, or did he know more about its contents than he admitted? Before she could press further, the church door creaked open, and the sexton, a stooped man named Mr. Hargreaves, shuffled in with a broom. "Morning, Reverend," he said, nodding to Miss Marple. "Just tidying up before evensong." Wells seized the interruption, his relief palpable. Yes, thank you, Hargreaves," he said, hurrying to the vestry. "I must prepare my notes. Excuse me, Miss Marple." She rose, her expression unchanged, but her mind was alight with observations. Wells's nervousness was more than mere shock at the theft. It was the anxiety of a man carrying a secret. As she stepped outside, she paused to chat with Mr. Hargreaves, who was sweeping the aisle with methodical care. "The Reverend seems troubled," she remarked, her tone casual. "I suppose the Bible's loss has upset him greatly." Hargreaves snorted, leaning on his broom. "Troubled? He's been jumpy as a cat since last week. Came to me asking about old religious artifacts, of all things. Wanted to know if there were collectors in the area, how much such things might fetch. Odd, I thought, for a man of his calling." He shook his head, resuming his sweeping. "Never seen him so out of sorts." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, but she kept her tone light. How curious. Perhaps he was researching for a sermon. She thanked Hargreaves and made her way back to Willow Grange, her umbrella tapping the path. The sexton's words were a revelation. Wells's inquiries about artifacts suggested an interest that went beyond spiritual reverence. Was he tempted by the relic's value, or was he acting on behalf of someone else? In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a curate who, under financial strain, had sold church silver to a dealer, claiming it was for the poor. The parallel was striking, and she filed it away for further consideration. Back at the manor, the house was abuzz with Inspector Craddock's ongoing investigation. He had gathered the guests in the drawing room, his questions growing sharper as leads remained elusive. Miss Marple slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. Craddock was questioning Edward, whose indignation was as loud as ever. "I tell you, Inspector, it's the staff. One of them must have taken it." Clara, standing by the window, rolled her eyes, while Mr. Gray watched the exchange with his usual detached calm. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the empty glass case, its velvet cushion a stark reminder of the theft. She thought of Wells's trembling hands, his evasive answers, his inquiries about artifacts. His piety, she suspected, was a cloak for something else. Guilt, perhaps, or fear of discovery. yet she needed more to connect him to the crime. The Bible's compartment, with its rumored relic, was the key, and Wells's knowledge of it, however he might deny it, was a thread she would follow. As Craddock dismissed the group, Miss Marple caught sight of Wells entering the room, his prayer book clutched tightly. He avoided her gaze, moving to speak with Beatrice, his voice low and earnest. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The pastor's burden was heavier than she had first thought, and she was determined to uncover its weight. The truth, as she had learned in countless village intrigues, often lay in the smallest details, the nervous gesture, the unguarded word, the secret held too tightly. She would watch and wait for Reverend Wells to reveal his. Chapter 6. The Mysterious Guest. The afternoon at Willow Grange carried a restless energy, as if the house itself were impatient for the mystery of the stolen Bible to be resolved. The rain had given way to a fitful sun, and its light slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the library with a cup of tea and her ever-present knitting, observed the comings and goings of the household with her usual quiet vigilance. Her inquiries thus far had painted a vivid picture of motives: Edward's financial strain, Clara's bitter resentment, Reverend Wells's nervous secrecy. But it was Mr. Lawrence Gray, the enigmatic guest, who intrigued her most. His polished charm and vague explanations for his presence at the reunion suggested a man with secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel them. Mr. Gray was an anomaly at Willow Grange, a figure who seemed to glide through the tensions of the Havisham family with an ease that bordered on detachment. Introduced as a friend of Beatrice's late husband, his connection to the family was tenuous at best, and his behavior, courteous yet curiously observant, had caught Miss Marple's attention from the start. She had noticed his habit of lingering near the drawing room, his eyes often resting on the Bible's case, and the faint smudge of dust on his hands, as if he had handled something ancient. These details, small but telling, suggested he was more than a casual guest, and Miss Marple resolved to learn his true purpose. She found him in the billiard room, a dimly lit space where the green baize table stood unused, its cues neatly racked. Gray was alone, leafing through a volume of antiquarian books from the library, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his face breaking into a smile that was both warm and calculated. "Miss Marple," he said, closing the book with a soft thud. "I didn't expect to find you here. Are you a fan of billiards?" Miss Marple returned his smile, her expression as mild as ever. "Oh no, Mr. Gray. I'm afraid I'm too old for such games. I was merely seeking a quiet place to think, and this room seemed inviting." She settled into a leather armchair, her knitting in her lap, and gestured to the book in his hands. "You seem quite taken with the library's collection. Are you a scholar of old books?" Gray's smile didn't waver, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his fingers on the book's cover. "A dabbler, perhaps," he said lightly. "I've always had a fondness for history, and the Havishams have quite a collection. This one's on medieval manuscripts. Fascinating stuff." He tapped the book, a heavy tome bound in faded leather, and set it aside with a care that suggested familiarity with such objects. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "Medieval manuscripts? How interesting. I suppose the family Bible would fit right in with such a study. It's such a remarkable piece, isn't it? So old, so full of secrets." Her tone was conversational, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any flicker of reaction. Gray's expression remained smooth, though his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. The Bible? Yes, it's a fine artifact. A pity it's gone missing. I imagine it's caused quite a stir for poor Beatrice. His voice was sympathetic, but Miss Marple noted the careful neutrality of his words, as if he were measuring each one. "Indeed," she said, her tone gentle. "It's curious, though, how such a well-guarded item could vanish. The case was locked, the key with Beatrice, yet someone managed to take it. You were in the drawing room before the theft, weren't you? I seem to recall you near the case." Her question was soft, almost apologetic, but it carried the weight of her observation. Gray's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "Was I? I suppose I was admiring the room's decor. It's a grand old house, full of treasures. But I assure you, Miss Marple, I had no hand in the Bible's disappearance." He leaned back, crossing his arms, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. "I'm just a guest here, after all." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly interest. "Of course, Mr. Gray. Though, I must say, your presence adds a certain mystery to the reunion. Beatrice mentioned you were a friend of her late husband, but she was rather vague about the details. How did you come to know the Havershams?" Her question was polite, but it was a probe, designed to test the edges of his story. Gray's smile returned, though it was a shade less warm. "Oh, it's an old connection. I met Sir Henry years ago in London. We shared an interest in rare books, and he invited me to visit Willow Grange. When Beatrice wrote to say she was hosting the reunion, I thought it a fine opportunity to pay my respects." His explanation was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the lack of specifics, the way he avoided elaborating on his ties to the family. It was the kind of vagueness she had encountered before in St. Mary Mead, when a charming newcomer had turned out to be a con artist passing through. She shifted the conversation, her tone as light as a summer breeze. "Rare books must lead you to all sorts of fascinating discoveries. I've heard the Haversham Bible contains a hidden compartment, perhaps a relic, something of great value. You must have come across such things in your studies." Her eyes met his, and she saw a flicker of something, caution, perhaps, or recognition, before he masked it with a chuckle. "A relic? That's the sort of tale that grows around old families," he said, his voice easy. "I've heard the rumors, but I've never seen the Bible up close. If there's a compartment, it's news to me." He rose, stretching slightly, and glanced at his watch. "I should check on Beatrice. She seemed quite upset this morning. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple." She nodded, her smile serene, but her mind was alight with observations. Gray's deflection was polished, but his quick exit suggested discomfort. His interest in medieval manuscripts, his proximity to the Bible's case, his vague connection to the family, all were threads in the tapestry of the theft. As he left the room, Miss Marple noticed he left the book open on the table, its pages turned to a chapter on reliquaries. A coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. She rose and approached the book, her fingers brushing the page. The text described the trade in sacred relics during the Middle Ages, their value to collectors and churches alike. A passage caught her eye. Relics, often housed in secret compartments, were prized not only for their spiritual significance, but for their market value, fetching sums that could sustain a family for generations. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Gray's choice of reading was too pointed to be accidental. Did he know of the Bible's relic, and was he here to acquire it? Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who entered the billiard room with a weary sigh. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding in greeting. "Still no sign of the Bible. I've got men searching the outbuildings now, but I'm starting to think it's left the estate." His frustration was evident, and Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile. "It's a perplexing case, Inspector," she said, "but I find that the answers often lie closer than we think. Have you spoken with Mr. Gray at length? He's an interesting man, don't you think? So unmoored from the family, yet so present." Her tone was mild, but Craddock caught the hint of suggestion. "Gray?" he said, frowning. "He's been cooperative, but his story's thin. Says he's here for old time's sake, but I can't find anyone who remembers him from Sir Henry's days. I'm checking his background, but it's slow going." He glanced at the open book on the table. "What's this?" Miss Marple explained, her voice casual. "Just something Mr. Gray was reading, about relics and manuscripts. It's curious, isn't it, how his interests align with the Bible's rumored secret?" She let the observation hang, and Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You think he's involved?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "I think," Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their rhythm, "that people who know too much often pretend to know too little. But then, I'm only an old woman who notices things." She smiled, and Craddock, accustomed to her understated wisdom, made a note to dig deeper into Gray's past. As he left, Miss Marple returned to her seat, her thoughts circling Gray. His charm was a shield, his vagueness a strategy. In St. Mary Mead, she had once met a man much like him, a dealer in antiques who had posed as a guest to steal a silver chalice from a manor house. The parallel was striking, and she wondered if Gray's presence at Willow Grange was as opportunistic. The Bible's relic, if it existed, would be a prize for a man with his interests, but his careful denials suggested he was playing a longer game. The library grew quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of a clock. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her mind weaving together the threads of the case. Gray's secrets, like those of the others, were hidden in plain sight, waiting for her to uncover them. She would continue to watch, to listen, and to wait for the moment when the truth, as it always did, slipped through the cracks of human deception. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Dust. The late afternoon light filtered through the heavy drapes of Willow Grange's drawing room, casting a soft glow over the empty glass case that had once held the Havisham family Bible. The room, usually a hub of family chatter, was now a silent stage for investigation, its air thick with the lingering tension of the theft. Miss Jane Marple, ever the unobtrusive presence, stood near the fireplace, her small figure dwarfed by the grandeur of the oak-paneled walls. Her knitting lay forgotten in the morning room. Today, her focus was on the scene of the crime itself. The fruitless searches conducted by Inspector Craddock and his men had left the household restless, but Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and eye for detail, believed the answer lay not in the outbuildings or distant corners of the estate, but here, in the heart of the manor. The drawing room was a study in contrasts, opulent yet faded, proud yet vulnerable. The portraits of Havisham ancestors gazed down with stern disapproval, as if chastising the current generation for their failure to protect the family's treasure. Miss Marple's attention, however, was fixed on the glass case, its brass lock gleaming in the dim light. The case stood on a polished mahogany table, its surface so pristine it reflected the chandelier above. Beatrice had insisted the case was locked at all times, with the key kept on her person, yet the Bible had vanished without a trace of forced entry. This, Miss Marple knew, pointed to a thief with intimate knowledge of the household's routines, or access to a duplicate key. She approached the case, her movements slow and deliberate, mindful not to disturb the scene. Inspector Craddock had examined it thoroughly, noting the absence of scratches or pry marks, but Miss Marple's method was different. Where the inspector saw facts, she saw stories, tales told by the smallest details, the kind others overlooked. Kneeling carefully, her joints protesting the effort, she studied the table's surface. The polish was flawless, tended daily by the meticulous housemaids, yet something caught her eye. A faint disturbance in the dust, barely visible in the slanting light. It was not the rectangular outline of the Bible, which would have been broad and distinct, but a smaller, irregular shape, as if a compact object had been placed there briefly and removed. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind racing. The smudge suggested that something had been taken from within the Bible. Perhaps the rumored relic, a saint's finger bone housed in a silver reliquary, as Beatrice had hinted. If the thief had opened the Bible, extracted the relic, and left the book itself behind, it would explain the smudge's size. But why take the entire Bible if the relic was the true prize? The answer, she suspected, lay in concealment, to hide the fact that the compartment had been tampered with, or to delay discovery of the relic's absence. This pointed to a thief who knew the Bible's secret, a short list that included Beatrice, Edward, and, by their own admissions, Clara, and possibly Mr. Gray. She rose, brushing her hands, and turned her attention to the room itself. The French doors leading to the terrace were locked, their bolts undisturbed, and the windows showed no signs of tampering. The thief had not entered from outside. The crime was an inside job, as Craddock had concluded. Yet the precision of the theft, the absence of damage, the silent execution, suggested a plan carefully laid. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects, each with their own motives and opportunities. Edward's financial woes made him a candidate, but his bluster seemed designed to deflect suspicion. Clara's resentment and knowledge of the Bible's compartment made her a strong contender, yet her accusations against Edward felt too pointed, as if meant to mislead. Reverend Wells's nervous piety and inquiries about artifacts hinted at a hidden agenda, while Mr. Gray's polished vagueness and interest in relics marked him as a wild card. As she pondered, the door opened, and Inspector Craddock entered, his face etched with the weariness of a man chasing shadows. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding. "Still poking about? My men have turned this place upside down. Nothing. Not a fingerprint, not a scrap of evidence." His tone was tinged with frustration, and Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile. "It's a vexing puzzle, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle. "But I find that the smallest things often speak the loudest. Have you noticed this?" She gestured to the table, pointing out the faint smudge in the dust. Craddock knelt, squinting, and his eyebrows rose. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "That's no accident. Something was moved here, something smaller than the Bible." He straightened, his eyes narrowing. "You think the thief took something from inside it?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's possible. The Bible is said to contain a relic, a saint's bone, perhaps, in a reliquary. If the thief knew of it, they might have taken the book to hide their true target. She paused, letting Craddock absorb the idea. It would require knowledge of the compartment and access to the case. Craddock rubbed his chin, considering. Beatrice says only she and Edward knew where the key was kept, in a locked drawer in her study, but locks can be picked or keys duplicated. And if this relic is valuable? His voice trailed off, and he made a note in his book. I'll have the staff check for any signs of tampering in the study, but who'd know about this relic, besides Beatrice and Edward? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Clara Morton, for one. She studied the family archives and mentioned the compartment to me. Reverend Wells, too, seems aware of it, though he denies seeing it. And Mr. Gray, his reading habits suggest an interest in such things. She spoke lightly, as if merely musing, but Craddock caught the weight of her words. "You've been busy," he said, a grudging respect in his tone. "I'll question them again, see if I can shake anything loose. But this smudge, it's a start." He glanced at the case, his frustration giving way to determination. "If the relic's the key, we need to find out who'd want it and why." As Craddock left to organize his men, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze returning to the smudge. It was a small clue, but in her experience, small clues were the hinges on which great mysteries turned. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen locket had been traced to a maid who left a smudge of flour on a dresser, revealing her presence at the scene. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that human carelessness often betrayed the most careful plans. She stepped to the French doors, peering out at the terrace where the reunion had unfolded. The memory of that day replayed in her mind. Edward's booming proclamations, Clara's barbed remarks, Wells's nervous hovering, Gray's calculated calm. Each had been near the case at some point. Each had opportunity. But the smudge pointed to precision, to a thief who knew exactly what they were after. Clara's expertise made her a likely candidate, but Gray's interest in relics and Wells' inquiries about artifact markets could not be dismissed. Even Edward, with his debts, might have seen the relic as a lifeline. The door opened again, and Beatrice entered, her face pale but composed. "Jane," she said, her voice weary, "have you found anything? This whole affair is tearing the family apart." Her hands twisted together, and Miss Marple saw the strain in her eyes, the weight of her role as matriarch. "Nothing certain, Beatrice," Miss Marple said gently, "but I believe we're closer than we were. The truth has a way of surfacing, like a stone in a stream." She gestured to the case. "This smudge. Do you think anything was kept near the Bible, something small that might have been moved?" Beatrice frowned, approaching the table. "No, nothing." The table was kept clear to show off the Bible. But she hesitated, her eyes widening. "The compartment. You think someone took the relic?" "It's a possibility," Miss Marple said, watching her cousin closely. "You mentioned a saint's bone in a reliquary. Would anyone else know of it?" Beatrice shook her head, then paused. "Clara, perhaps. She's pored over the family records. And Edward, of course. I never told the others, but secrets have a way of spreading in a house like this." Her voice was bitter, and Miss Marple nodded, understanding the fragility of family trust. As Beatrice left, Miss Marple returned to her study of the room. The smudge was a clue, but it was not enough. The thief had been careful, but no one was flawless. She would need to watch the suspects more closely to catch the slip that would betray them. Clara's knowledge, Wells's unease, Gray's secrecy, Edward's desperation, each was a piece of the puzzle, and the smudge was the first clear link to the truth. Miss Marple's needles, had they been in her hands, would have clicked with satisfaction. The game was advancing, and she was ready for the next move. Chapter 8. The Family Secret. The evening settled over Willow Grange with a quiet that felt more like a held breath than true calm. The theft of the family Bible had cast a shadow over the household, and the guests, once animated by the reunion's festivities, now moved, with the wariness of those who sensed accusation in every glance. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with a cup of chamomile tea, her knitting resting idle in her lap, reflected on the threads she had gathered thus far. The faint smudge on the drawing-room table had confirmed her suspicion that the Bible's hidden relic, a saint's finger bone in a silver reliquary, was likely the true target of the theft. Yet the question remained: who among the suspects had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the motive to steal it? To answer this, Miss Marple sought a deeper understanding of the Bible's secret, and there was no one better to consult than Lady Beatrice Haversham, the keeper of the family's history. Beatrice was in her private study, a small cluttered room off the main hall, its walls lined with family portraits and shelves of dusty ledgers. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and lavender, and a single lamp cast a warm glow over Beatrice's desk, where she sat, her hands clasped tightly. Her face, usually composed, bore the strain of the past 2 days, lines of worry etched deeper, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. Miss Marple knocked softly, and Beatrice looked up, managing a tired smile. "Jane, do come in," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I'm afraid I'm poor company tonight. This business with the Bible, it's more than I can bear." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her demeanor as gentle as ever, though her eyes were sharp with purpose. "It's a heavy burden, Beatrice," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The Bible is more than an heirloom, isn't it? It carries a secret that makes its loss all the more significant. I wonder if you might tell me more about it, about the relic, and who might know of it." Her tone was one of kindly concern, but it carried the quiet insistence of someone who knew the importance of truth. Beatrice's hands tightened, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate, as if weighing how much to reveal. Then, with a sigh, she leaned back, her gaze drifting to a portrait of a stern-faced Haversham ancestor above the desk. "You're right, Jane," she said. "The Bible is more than a book. It's been in our family since the reign of Elizabeth I, passed down through generations. But its true value lies in what it conceals. A relic, a fragment of bone said to belong to St. Cuthbert, encased in a silver reliquary. It's been a closely guarded secret, known only to the head of the family and their chosen heir." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. St. Cuthbert, a remarkable figure. Such a relic would be priceless, both spiritually and otherwise. She let the word hang, watching Beatrice's reaction. "You and Edward know of it, then. But could others have learned of it? Clara, perhaps, with her research, or someone outside the family?" Beatrice's eyes flickered with unease. "Clara, yes," she admitted. "She's spent years combing through our archives, and she's clever. Too clever, sometimes. I caught her examining the Bible once, late at night, with a magnifying glass. She said she was studying the annotations, but I wondered if she'd found the compartment. I never confronted her. It seemed disloyal to doubt her. She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the desk. As for others, I've kept the secret close, but servants talk, and old houses have ears. It's possible someone overheard or found a record in the archives. Miss Marple's mind turned to Clara's detailed knowledge of the Bible, her resentment toward Edward, and her quick dismissal of the relic as a legend. The cousin's expertise made her a prime suspect, but Beatrice's words suggested another possibility, that the secret had spread beyond the inner circle. "And the key to the case," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "You said it was kept in a locked drawer here. Could anyone have accessed it?" Beatrice gestured to a small, ornate drawer in her desk. "It's always here, locked, and I keep the desk key with me. Only Edward knows where it is. He's the heir, after all. But—" She hesitated, her voice dropping. "I've been careless at times, leaving the desk unlocked when I'm called away. It's possible someone could have taken an impression of the key, or even borrowed it briefly." Her admission was reluctant, and Miss Marple saw the guilt in her eyes, the weight of a matriarch who felt she had failed her family. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone reassuring. "You've done your best, Beatrice. Secrets are hard to keep, especially in a family as large as yours. But tell me, have you ever shown the relic to anyone, or opened the compartment yourself?" Beatrice shook her head. "Not in years. The last time was when Edward came of age, and I showed him the compartment as part of his inheritance. It's a delicate thing, the reliquary. Silver with tiny engravings, about the size of a locket. The bone inside is barely a fragment, but it's sacred to us. I couldn't bear to think of it in the wrong hands." Her voice broke, and she looked away, her hands trembling. Miss Marple's heart went out to her cousin, but her mind was focused, piecing together the clues. The reliquary's size matched the smudge on the drawing-room table, confirming her theory that it was the true target. The thief, then, had known not only of the compartment, but how to access it without damaging the Bible. A task requiring both knowledge and finesse. Clara's expertise made her a likely candidate, but Reverend Wells's inquiries about artifact markets and Mr. Gray's interest in medieval manuscripts could not be ignored. Even Edward, despite his role as heir, might have seen the relic as a solution to his debts. She shifted the conversation, her tone light but probing. "It's curious, isn't it, how such a small thing can cause such a stir? A relic like that could tempt many, someone in need of money or someone who values its historical worth. Have you noticed anyone showing unusual interest in the Bible recently?" Beatrice frowned, considering. "Clara, as I said, has always been curious, and Reverend Wells, he's asked to see the Bible several times, saying it would inspire his sermons. I thought it odd, but he's a man of God, so I didn't question it. As for Mr. Gray—" She hesitated, her brow furrowing. "He's been so kind, but I don't know him well. He wrote to me, offering condolences after Henry's death, and suggested visiting for the reunion. I thought it harmless, but now I wonder." Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Mr. Gray is certainly a mystery," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "But then, families often attract such figures, don't they? Like moths to a flame." She smiled, but her mind was racing. Gray's vague connection to the family, his interest in relics, and his presence at the reunion all pointed to a purpose beyond mere courtesy. Was he a collector, an opportunist, or something else entirely? Before Beatrice could respond, a knock at the door announced Inspector Craddock. His face was grim, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Lady Beatrice, Miss Marple," he said, nodding. "I've checked the drawer. No signs of tampering, but that doesn't mean much. A skilled thief could make a wax impression of the key in minutes." He glanced at Miss Marple, his eyes narrowing. "You've been talking to everyone, haven't you? Found anything new?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Only what one expects in a house like this. Inspector, secrets and shadows. But Beatrice has been most helpful. The Bible's relic seems to be the heart of the matter, and I suspect our thief knew exactly what they were after." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "Have you looked into the backgrounds of our guests? Mr. Gray, for instance, seems to have a particular interest in antiquities." Craddock nodded, making a note. "I'm waiting on word from London about him. His story about knowing Sir Henry is shaky. No one in the village remembers him. And Wells, I've got a constable checking his recent activities. He's been asking odd questions about artifact markets, according to the sexton." He sighed, his frustration evident. "This case is like chasing smoke." "Smoke clears in time, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "It's a matter of watching where it drifts." She rose, excusing herself, and left Beatrice and Craddock to discuss the next steps. As she stepped into the hall, her mind turned over Beatrice's revelations. The relic's value, both spiritual and financial, made it a powerful lure, and the list of those who might know of it was growing. Clara, Wells, possibly Gray, and Edward himself. The locked drawer, the smudge, the absence of forced entry, all pointed to a thief within the household, someone trusted enough to move freely. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once solved a theft by noticing a misplaced key in a vicar's study, left carelessly by a trusted parishioner with debts. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that secrets, like keys, were often betrayed by those closest to them. She would need to speak with Clara again, to probe Wells' motives further, and to watch Gray closely. The family secret was out, and with it, the thief's advantage was slipping. Miss Marple's needles, had they been in her hands, would have clicked with quiet determination. The truth was near, and she was ready to grasp it. Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. The evening at Willow Grange was cloaked in a restless hush, the kind that follows a storm when the air is charged with the promise of more to come. The theft of the Havisham family Bible had frayed the nerves of the household, and the guests, now confined by Inspector Craddock's orders, moved with the guarded caution of those who sensed suspicion in every shadow. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the conservatory with her knitting in her lap, felt the weight of the case pressing closer to its resolution. The smudge on the drawing-room table, Beatrice's revelation about the relic and the motives of the suspects, Edward's debts, Clara's resentment, Wells's secretive inquiries, Gray's enigmatic presence, had woven a tapestry of clues. Yet the truth remained elusive, hidden in the crevices of human deceit. Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for such matters, knew that the thief's confidence would be their undoing, and she resolved to set a trap to draw them out. Her plan was simple yet cunning, rooted in her understanding of human nature's tendency to betray itself under pressure. She sought out Inspector Craddock, finding him in the library, where he was reviewing his notes with a furrowed brow. The room was dim, lit only by a pair of lamps that cast flickering shadows over the shelves of ancient books. Craddock looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of weariness and respect. "Miss Marple," he said, setting his notebook aside, "I'm beginning to think this Bible has sprouted wings. We've searched every nook of this house. Nothing. Any ideas?" Miss Marple's smile was serene, her eyes twinkling with purpose. "I find, Inspector, that when a thief hides something well, it's often because they're watching closely. I propose we give them something new to watch." She leaned forward, her voice low but clear. "Suppose we let it be known that a second relic has been found, say, in the library, among the family archives. If the thief took the Bible for its reliquary, they might be tempted to act again, believing another prize is within reach." Craddock's eyebrows rose, and a slow grin spread across his face. "A trap? That's clever, Miss Marple. Risky, but clever. How do we spread the word without tipping our hand?" "Leave that to me," she said, her tone mild but confident. "A word here, a hint there. Gossip travels faster than a telegram in a house like this. We'll watch the suspects closely and see who takes the bait." Craddock nodded, his skepticism giving way to intrigue. They agreed to meet later that evening to finalize the details, and Miss Marple set about planting the seed. She began with Beatrice, knowing her cousin's distress would lend authenticity to the ruse. Over tea in the morning room, Miss Marple spoke casually, her voice just loud enough to be overheard by a passing maid. "Beatrice, dear, I heard the most extraordinary thing from one of the archivists you consulted. They found a reference to another relic in the family papers, something hidden in the library, perhaps in one of the old folios. Could it be true?" Beatrice, catching the glint in Miss Marple's eye, played along, her surprise genuine enough to convince any eavesdropper. "Another relic? Oh, Jane, that would be remarkable. I must look into it at once." The rumor spread like wildfire. By dinner, the household was abuzz with whispers of a second relic, and Miss Marple noted the reactions of the suspects with keen interest. Edward, seated at the head of the table, dismissed the idea with a scoff, his focus on his wine glass and the estate's dwindling finances. Another relic? Nonsense. The Bible was enough trouble. His indifference seemed genuine, but Miss Marple wondered if it was a mask for calculation. Reverend Wells, picking at his food, grew visibly agitated, his fork trembling as he murmured about the sanctity of such finds. "If true, it must be protected," he said, his voice strained, and Miss Marple caught his glance toward the library door. Mr. Gray, ever composed, raised an eyebrow and asked Beatrice for details, his tone polite but probing. "A second relic? How fascinating. Have you found the volume yet, Lady Beatrice?" His interest was measured, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tapped the table, a subtle sign of restlessness. Clara, however, reacted most strikingly. She excused herself midway through the meal, claiming a headache, and slipped out of the dining room with a haste that drew Miss Marple's attention. The cousin's sharp eyes and quick departure suggested she was not as indifferent as she claimed. That night, Miss Marple and Craddock positioned themselves in the library, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain that shielded a recessed window. The room was dark, save for a single lamp left burning to suggest someone had been working late. A decoy, a leather-bound book with a hastily crafted relic of polished bone tucked inside, was placed prominently on a reading table, its pages marked with a ribbon to draw attention. Miss Marple, her breathing slow and steady, felt the familiar thrill of the chase, tempered by the patience of one who knew human nature's weaknesses would surface in time. The hours ticked by, the house settling into silence as the clock struck midnight. Then a faint creak broke the stillness, the library door opening. Miss Marple peered through a slit in the curtain, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. A figure entered, moving with cautious grace, their silhouettes slim and purposeful. As they approached the table, the lamplight revealed Clara Morton, her face pale but resolute, her hands gloved to avoid leaving prints. She lifted the decoy book, her fingers deftly searching its binding, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. Clara's expertise was evident, her movements those of someone who knew exactly what to look for. Craddock tensed beside her, ready to step out, but Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his arm, signaling patience. Clara opened the book, found the relic, and slipped it into her pocket with a swiftness that spoke of practice. As she turned to leave, Craddock emerged, his voice sharp. "Miss Morton, I think you'd better stay where you are." Clara froze, her eyes wide with shock, the book slipping from her hands. "Inspector, I was only looking," she stammered, but her voice faltered under Craddock's stern gaze. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression one of quiet disappointment. "Clara, my dear," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You knew about the Bible's compartment, didn't you? And you thought another relic might be here?" Clara's defiance crumbled, her shoulders sagging. "I didn't mean any harm," she whispered, her eyes darting to the door. I needed the money. Edward doesn't deserve the Bible or anything else. I thought if I could sell the relic, I could fund my research, prove our history matters." Her words spilled out, a mix of guilt and justification, and Miss Marple listened, her heart heavy but unsurprised. Craddock took the relic from her pocket, examining it with a frown. "This is a fake, Miss Morton, but it proves you're no stranger to theft." He turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You were right, she couldn't resist." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on Clara. "People often betray themselves when they think they're safe," she said gently. "But Clara, where is the Bible now? And the true relic?" Clara's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. "The Bible's in my room, hidden in my suitcase. I took the reliquary out. It's with a contact in London, a collector. I was going to retrieve the Bible later, make it look like it was misplaced." Her voice was barely audible, and Miss Marple saw the shame in her eyes, the weight of a plan gone awry. Craddock signaled to a constable waiting outside, who took Clara into custody with quiet efficiency. As they led her away, Miss Marple turned to Craddock, her expression thoughtful. "She acted out of resentment, Inspector, but also desperation. The relic's value was her temptation, but I wonder if others knew of her plan." Her mind flickered to Wells' agitation, Gray's probing questions, Edward's indifference. Was Clara the sole culprit, or had someone else nudged her toward the act? Craddock nodded, his notebook open. "We'll recover the Bible and track down this collector. But Miss Marple, that was a neat trick. You've got a knack for this." His tone held a grudging respect, and Miss Marple's smile was modest. "I only notice what people reveal, Inspector," she said, her needles clicking softly as she retrieved her knitting from the conservatory. "And they always reveal something in the end." As she left the library, Her thoughts lingered on the remaining suspects. Clara's confession was a breakthrough, but the puzzle felt incomplete. The trap had caught its prey, but Miss Marple sensed other shadows still lurking in the corners of Willow Grange. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The night air at Willow Grange was thick with the scent of damp earth and fading roses, a reminder of the rain that had only recently ceased. Inside, the library's lamplight cast long shadows as Clara Morton sat, her defiance reduced to a trembling silence, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Miss Jane Marple stood near the window, her small figure framed by the velvet curtains, her expression one of quiet resolve. Inspector Craddock, his notebook open, paced the room with the measured steps of a man piecing together the final fragments of a puzzle. Clara's confession, elicited by the cunning trap of a decoy relic, had brought the theft of the Havisham family Bible into sharp focus. But Miss Marple knew that the truth, like the threads of her knitting, required careful weaving to reveal the full pattern. Craddock stopped pacing, his eyes fixed on Clara. "Let's have it all, Miss Morton," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You've admitted to taking the Bible and its reliquary. Where is the relic now, and who's this collector in London?" His pen hovered over his notebook, ready to capture every detail. Clara's gaze dropped to the floor, her face pale under the lamplight. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was angry at Edward, at the way he lords over everything, as if the rest of us don't matter. The Bible, the relic, it was a way to take something back, to prove I could do more with it than he ever would." She looked up, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's, and there was a flicker of shame in them, as if she recognized the futility of her justification. Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone gentle but unyielding. "Clara, dear, I understand resentment can drive us to desperate acts, but the relic, St. Cuthbert's bone, in its silver case, why sell it? Surely you knew its value to the family, beyond mere money." Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of her insight, probing for the deeper motive behind Clara's actions. Clara's hands twisted together, and she drew a shaky breath. "It wasn't just the money," she said, her voice low. "I've spent years researching the Havishams, piecing together our history, but Edward dismissed it all. He'd have sold the estate if he could to pay his debts. I thought, if I could sell the relic, I could fund my work, publish the family's story, show the world what we really are. The collector, he promised me enough to keep going for years." Her voice faltered, and she looked away, as if the weight of her betrayal was too much to bear. Craddock's pen scratched across the page. "This collector, who is he, and how did you find him?" His tone was sharp, demanding precision. Clara hesitated, then spoke, her words reluctant. "His name's Mr. Hargrove, an antiquarian in London. I met him at a historical society meeting last year. He specializes in religious artifacts, and when I mentioned the Havisham Bible in passing, he was very interested. He said a relic like St. Cuthbert's could fetch a fortune. Tens of thousands, maybe more. I didn't tell him I'd take it, not then. But after the reunion was planned, and I saw Edward strutting about, I contacted him. He agreed to buy it, no questions asked." Her voice was barely audible, and Miss Marple noted the slump of her shoulders, the defeat in her posture. Miss Marple's mind turned over the details, her thoughts as precise as the stitches in her knitting. Clara's motive was clear. Resentment and ambition tangled together. but her confession raised new questions. Hargrove's involvement suggested a wider network, and Miss Marple wondered if others in the household had been approached by such figures. Reverend Wells's inquiries about artifact markets came to mind, as did Mr. Gray's interest in medieval manuscripts. Could either have been in contact with Hargrove or someone like him? Craddock pressed on, his voice steady. And the Bible itself, where is it now? You said it's in your room. Be specific, Miss Morton. Clara swallowed, her eyes darting to the door as if hoping for escape. It's in my suitcase, under the bed. I wrapped it in a shawl to keep it safe. I was going to return it later, make it look like it was misplaced during the reunion. I only took the reliquary out. I used a letter opener to pry open the compartment. It was easier than I thought. Her admission was stark, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of regret in her eyes, the realization of how far she had strayed. Craddock nodded to a constable who left to retrieve the Bible. He turned back to Clara, his expression stern. You realize this is a serious crime, Miss Morton. Theft, trafficking in stolen artifacts. It's not just a family matter anymore. You'll need to come with us to the station, and we'll contact this Hargrove immediately. Clara nodded, her face crumpling as the reality sank in. Miss Marple, watching her, felt a pang of sympathy but no surprise. St. Mary Mead, she had seen similar cases, people driven by passion or pride to acts they later regretted. A schoolteacher, bitter at being overlooked, had once stolen a rare book from the village library, hoping to sell it to fund her own ambitions. Clara's motives were not so different, but the stakes were higher, and the consequences would be severe. Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but firm. Clara, you mentioned Edward's debts. Did you suspect he might try to sell the relic himself? Or did anyone else know of your plan? Her question was gentle, but it probed for loose ends, for the possibility that Clara was not acting alone. Clara shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. No one knew. I didn't trust anyone enough to tell them. As for Edward, I just assumed he'd sell anything he could get his hands on. He's desperate, but I acted alone. I had to. Her words carried a note of finality, but Miss Marple's instincts told her there was more to explore. Clara's isolation seemed genuine, but the relic's value was no secret, and others might have been tempted. Craddock, satisfied for the moment, turned to Miss Marple. You've done it again, Miss Marple, he said, a grudging admiration in his tone. That trap was a stroke of genius. We'll have the Bible back by morning, and with luck, we'll recover the relic from this Hargrove fellow. He paused, his eyes narrowing. But you don't think this is the end of it, do you? Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes thoughtful. I think, Inspector, that Clara has told us the truth, as she knows it, but families like the Havershams have many secrets, and secrets draw curious eyes. I'd be curious to know more about Mr. Hargrove, and whether anyone else in this house has crossed his path. Her words were light, but they carried the weight of her suspicion, and Craddock made a note to investigate further. As the constable returned with the Bible, its leather cover slightly scuffed but intact, a ripple of relief passed through the room. Beatrice, summoned to confirm its authenticity, clutched it to her chest, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you, Jane," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was lost forever." Miss Marple patted her cousin's hand, her expression kind but distracted. "It's safe now, Beatrice, but we must be vigilant. The relic is still out there, and its pull is strong. She glanced at Clara, who was being led away, her head bowed. The cousin's confession had solved one mystery, but Miss Marple's mind lingered on the others. Wells's nervous inquiries, Gray's calculated charm, Edward's financial straits. Was Clara's act truly solitary, or had someone else known of the relic's value, perhaps even encouraged her? As the library emptied, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze resting on the decoy book, its pages still open to the fake relic. The trap had worked, but it had also revealed the depth of greed and desperation within the household. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen painting had been recovered only to reveal a second thief waiting in the wings. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that human nature was rarely satisfied with one betrayal. The confrontation had brought clarity, but Miss Marple knew the final threads of the mystery were yet to be unraveled. Chapter 11. The Loose Ends. The morning sun broke through the clouds, bathing Willow Grange in a tentative light that seemed to promise resolution after days of tension. The recovery of the Havisham family Bible, found hidden in Clara Morton's suitcase, had lifted a weight from the household, but the absence of the relic, St. Cuthbert's bone in its silver reliquary, kept the air charged with unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting in her lap, reflected on the events of the previous night. Clara's confession, elicited by the clever trap of a decoy relic, had confirmed her as the thief, driven by resentment and a desperate ambition to fund her historical research. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, sensed that the puzzle was not fully solved. Loose ends remained, threads of motive and opportunity that tangled around the other suspects: Edward Havisham, Reverend Timothy Wells, and the enigmatic Mr. Lawrence Gray. Inspector Craddock, ever diligent, had dispatched a constable to London to track down Mr. Hargrove, the antiquarian Clara had contacted to sell the relic. The Bible, now restored to its glass case in the drawing room, was under guard, its leather cover a silent testament to the family's ordeal. Miss Marple, however, was not content to rest. Clara's confession, while damning, had raised questions about the others. Had anyone known of her plan, or had they harbored their own designs on the relic? To tie up these loose ends, Miss Marple sought to probe deeper, starting with a conversation she had been mulling since the trap was sprung. She found Edward in the study, poring over ledgers with a grim expression. His florid face was drawn, the lines of worry deeper than before, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hands as he turned a page. "Good morning, Edward," she said, her voice gentle as she settled into a chair. "I'm so pleased the Bible has been returned. It must be a great relief to you, as the heir." Edward looked up, his eyes weary but wary. "Relief? Hardly, Miss Marple. Clara's betrayal is a stain on the family name. I should have seen it coming. She's always been jealous." His tone was bitter, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something else. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. She leaned forward, her expression one of kindly concern. "It's a sad business," she agreed. "But Clara mentioned your financial troubles, Edward. She seemed to think you might have considered selling the relic yourself. Is there any truth to that?" Her question was soft, but it struck like a dart, and Edward's face reddened. "Sell the relic? That's absurd," he snapped, slamming the ledger shut. "I'm the heir. I'd never betray the family like that. Clara's just deflecting her own guilt." His indignation was loud, but Miss Marple noted the way. His eyes darted to the door, as if he feared being overheard. She recalled the village gossip about his debts, the unpaid accounts piling up, and wondered if his denial was as firm as he claimed. Before she could press further, Beatrice entered, her face pale but composed. "Jane, Edward," she said, nodding. "The inspectors just telephoned. They've located Mr. Hargrove in London. He's admitted to receiving the reliquary from Clara. It's being returned tomorrow." Her voice held a note of relief, but Miss Marple saw the strain in her eyes, the toll of the family's fractured trust. "That's excellent news, Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "But I wonder, did Clara act alone, or did anyone else know of her plan? Reverend Wells, for instance, seemed quite agitated about the Bible's loss." She let the question hang, watching both Beatrice and Edward for their reactions. Edward snorted, his scorn evident. "Wells? He's a nervous wreck, always has been, probably worried about his sermons." But Beatrice frowned, her fingers twisting the hem of her shawl. "Timothy did ask about the Bible often," she said slowly. "I thought it was just his piety, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple nodded, filing away Beatrice's doubt. She excused herself and made her way to the village church, where she found Reverend Wells in the vestry, sorting hymnals with a distracted air. His spectacles were fogged with nervous perspiration, and he started at her approach. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice high, "I heard the Bible's been found. A miracle, truly." "Indeed," she said, settling onto a bench. "Clara's confession was quite revealing. But I wonder, Reverend, if you suspected her. You were so concerned about the Bible, and I hear you've been asking about artifact markets. Were you worried someone might try to sell the relic?" Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, catching the flush that spread across his face. Wells's hands trembled, and he dropped a hymnal, stooping to retrieve it. I only asked out of curiosity," he stammered. "The Bible's sacred, and I feared it might fall into the wrong hands. When I heard it was missing, I suspected Clara. She's always been so intense about the family's history." His admission was reluctant, and Miss Marple saw the guilt in his eyes, the weight of a secret held too long. "You suspected her, yet said nothing," she said softly. "Why, Reverend? Was it loyalty or something else?" Her question was kind, but it probed deeply, and Wells's face crumpled. "I didn't want to cause trouble," he whispered. "Clara's been kind to the church, helping with records. I thought perhaps she'd return it. I should have spoken sooner." His confession was genuine, and Miss Marple saw no deception in it, only the weakness of a man torn between duty and misplaced loyalty. Her final inquiry was with Mr. Gray, whom she found on the terrace, sipping coffee and watching the garden with his usual detached calm. "Mr. Gray," she said, approaching with a smile, "the Bible's return is a relief, isn't it? Though I confess, I've been curious about your role here. You've been so helpful, yet so elusive." Her tone was light, but her eyes held a quiet challenge. Gray's smile was as polished as ever. "Elusive? I'm just a guest, Miss Marple, here to honor an old friend's memory. I'm glad the Bible's safe, though I suspect you had a hand in that." His charm was effortless, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of caution in his eyes. She tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Beatrice mentioned you wrote to her, suggesting this visit, and your interest in relics is quite striking. Were you aware of the Bible's secret?" Her question was direct, and Gray's smile faltered for a moment. "I knew of the rumors," he admitted, setting his cup down. "But I assure you, I had no part in the theft. In fact, Beatrice asked me to keep an eye on things. She suspected trouble, though she didn't say why. His revelation was unexpected, and Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "A private investigator, then?" she asked, her voice mild. Gray nodded, his expression rueful. "Of a sort. Beatrice wanted someone discreet to ensure the Bible's safety. I failed, I'm afraid, but your trap succeeded where I could not." His admission was candid, and Miss Marple saw no reason to doubt it, though his secrecy had complicated matters. As she returned to the morning room, her thoughts settled. Clara's confession had tied up the main thread, but Wells's silence and Gray's hidden role were the loose ends she had sought. In St. Mary Mead, a similar case had involved a trusted friend who kept silent about a theft, fearing family discord, much like Wells. Gray's role, too, echoed a hired watcher she had once known, whose secrecy had muddled a simple crime. The relic was on its way back, the Bible restored, and Clara would face justice. Yet Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing she had unraveled the tangle of motives and secrets that had threatened to unravel the Havisham family. Chapter 12. The Quiet Departure. The morning of Miss Jane Marple's departure from Willow Grange was bright and clear, the Sussex sky a vivid blue that seemed to wash away the shadows of the past few days. The Havisham family Bible, now safely restored to its glass case in the drawing room, gleamed under the watchful eyes of a newly installed lock, its leather cover a silent testament to the family's resilience. The relic, St. Cuthbert's bone in its silver reliquary, had been recovered from Mr. Hargrove in London, thanks to Inspector Craddock's swift action, and was once again hidden within the Bible's secret compartment. Clara Morton, her confession laying bare her resentment and ambition, awaited her fate in the hands of the authorities, her actions a cautionary tale of passion turned to folly. Yet for Miss Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting packed neatly in her bag, the case felt complete, its loose ends tied with the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle well solved. The household was subdued, the reunion's festive spirit replaced by a reflective calm. Edward Havisham, chastened by the ordeal, had vowed to manage the estate more prudently, his bluster softened by the near loss of the family's prized heirloom. Reverend Timothy Wells, his nervous piety tempered by his admission of silence, had returned to his church duties with a renewed sense of humility. Mr. Lawrence Gray, revealed as Beatrice's discreet guardian, had offered his apologies for his secrecy, his polished charm now tinged with a genuine respect for Miss Marple's acumen. Beatrice herself, though weary, radiated a quiet strength, her gratitude to her cousin palpable as she prepared to see her off. Miss Marple stood on the terrace, her small suitcase at her feet, as Beatrice approached, her face softened by relief. "Jane, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice warm with emotion. "You saw through the chaos, as you always do. The Bible, the relic, they're safe because of you." She clasped Miss Marple's hands, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Miss Marple smiled, her expression as gentle as the morning breeze. "You're too kind, Beatrice. I only listened and watched and let people tell their own stories. They always do, you know, if you give them time." Her words were modest, but her eyes held a quiet pride, the satisfaction of a mind that had unraveled the threads of human greed and deception. Beatrice hesitated, then spoke, her voice low. "Clara, I never imagined she'd go so far. And Edward, with his debts, I should have seen the tensions brewing. You've given us a chance to mend things, Jane." Her words carried the weight of a matriarch who had faced her family's flaws and emerged determined to heal them. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead, where similar dramas had played out in quieter settings. "Families are like old houses, Beatrice," she said. "They creak and groan, but they hold together if you tend to them. You'll do that, I'm sure." She patted Beatrice's hand, her touch reassuring. Inspector Craddock joined them, his notebook tucked away, his face relaxed for the first time in days. "Miss Marple, you've made my job look easy," he said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "That trap of yours was a masterstroke. I'll be telling this story at the station for years." His tone held a grudging admiration, and Miss Marple's smile widened. "You're very kind, Inspector," she said, her voice mild. "But it's only a matter of seeing what's there, isn't it? People are so very predictable once you know their ways." She paused, her eyes twinkling. "Though I must say, Mr. Gray's role was a surprise. A private investigator, hired to protect the Bible, yet he nearly missed the theft." Craddock chuckled, shaking his head. "He's kicking himself for that. Said he underestimated Clara's nerve. But you didn't, did you?" His question was rhetorical, and Miss Marple merely smiled, her silence an answer in itself. As the car arrived to take her to the station, Miss Marple glanced back at Willow Grange, its ivy-clad walls serene in the morning light. The house had weathered its storm, its secrets laid bare, and its treasures restored. She thought of Clara, driven by resentment to betray her family, of Wells, whose silence stemmed from misguided loyalty, of Gray, whose secrecy had muddled the truth, and of Edward, whose pride had nearly cost him everything. Each had played their part, and Miss Marple, with her quiet observation and unerring instinct, had brought clarity to their tangled motives. The car rolled down the drive, and Miss Marple settled back, her hands folded over her bag. She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly as the countryside unfolded beyond the window. In her mind, she replayed the case, the smudge on the table, the trap in the library, the confessions and revelations. It was not unlike a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch had revealed a web of village rivalries. The scale was grander here, but the human heart, with its frailties and desires, was the same. As the train station came into view, Miss Marple felt a quiet contentment. The Havershams would mend, and Willow Grange would endure. Its Bible a symbol of resilience rather than division. She tucked her knitting away, her thoughts already drifting to home, where new puzzles, no doubt, awaited her sharp mind and gentle wisdom. The truth, as she had always known, was never far from those who knew how to look for it.